Some families radiate elegance and power on the outside, yet behind closed doors they hide cruelty and greed. I once stepped into such a family, the Morrisons. They looked down on me, humiliated me, and in the end even stripped away the inheritance my husband left behind. They thought that by burning a check, they could erase me from their lives. But they were wrong. Because what Tim, my husband, left me was not on a piece of paper, but a living legacy, something no one could ever touch. This is not only a story of pain and betrayal, but also a journey of reclaiming justice, step by step, for myself and for my son. If you believe that the truth will always prevail and that the greedy must one day pay the price, stay with me. This story will hold you captive until the very end. Chapter 1. The Beginning of Prejudice. I still remember so clearly the first time I heard her say it. She doesn't deserve a cent. Not in a lawyer's office, not after my husband's death, but 3 years earlier in her luxurious kitchen, while I was hunched over the sink, washing a mountain of dishes after Sunday dinner. I heard Skylar's voice, my mother-in-law, whispering over the phone to her sister. She's just waiting for him to put a ring on her finger so she can bleed the Morrison family dry. Girls like that are always the same. I froze, my hands dripping wet in the dishwater. Girls like that. What did she mean? A girl who worked as a nurse, pulling double shifts just to make rent. A girl raised in cramped apartments instead of mansions with white columns and sprawling lawns. A girl whose father was a mechanic, whose mother shopped the clearance aisle at discount stores. I bit my lip, unable to say a word. I didn't dare. I never dared back then. Tim, my husband, the man I loved with all my heart, was upstairs taking a shower. He had no idea what his mother had just whispered, and I didn't tell him. I simply dried my hands and forced a smile when Tim came downstairs, his damp hair falling across his forehead, his eyes always so warm when they met mine. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked. I nodded quietly, following him to the door. But just before it closed, I turned back, and I caught Skylar's eyes on me. Her smile was cold, the kind that sent a shiver through my body as if she knew something I didn't. I didn't realize then that this tiny moment would be the seed of everything that followed. One sentence, one contemptuous glance, and an invisible boundary between them and me, a line I would spend years paying the price to cross. That was the beginning. And it was also the first time I truly understood I was never considered worthy of this family. Chapter 2. Love and the Divide of Class. I met Tim on what seemed like an ordinary morning. I had just finished a night shift at the hospital, exhausted, barely able to stop by my usual coffee shop for something to keep me awake. He was there 7:30 sharp every morning with a cup of black coffee and a blueberry muffin. We struck up a conversation by chance, at first just a few minutes, then stretching into half an hour. And after only a week, I realized I was looking forward to those morning talks more than anything else in my day. Tim was different from any man I had ever known. He listened, truly listened. He remembered the names of the patients I mentioned, asked about the surgeries, shared in the small details no one else ever seemed to care about. I felt seen, valued. I loved him before I even knew what family he came from. It wasn't until later that he mentioned his family's company, Morrison Industries. I had to look it up online to discover they were one of the largest construction and real estate corporations in the state. They had not just wealth, but influence. I only laughed at first, asking why he hadn't told me sooner. Tim shrugged. "I wanted you to know who I am not, where I come from." I thought that was sweet. But later I realized he was also avoiding a truth that our love would always be measured, scrutinized, weighed against the scale of money by his family. The first time I visited his home, I was overwhelmed. It wasn't just a house. It was a mansion on a hill with a winding driveway, towering white columns, and a lawn so perfectly manicured it looked like something from a magazine. I sat in my car for 10 extra minutes just to gather the courage to step out. Skylar's mother opened the door. The very first look she gave me made my blood run cold. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, calculating the worth of the nicest dress I owned at the pair of shoes I had saved a month's salary to buy. With just one glance, I knew that, to her, it was all cheap. Tim came running, beaming, as he introduced me. "Mom, this is Kelly. Isn't she beautiful?" Skylar smiled a thin smile and said, "Yes, cute." But her eyes said the opposite. That dinner felt less like a meal and more like an interview I was destined to fail. She asked what my father did, and I answered that he was a mechanic. She asked where I studied, and I spoke of the public university I had attended. I still remember how she paused, then said, "How noble. But nursing is just a service job, isn't it?" I wanted to explain that I was a pediatric cardiac nurse, that I had saved children after heart surgeries, that my work sometimes meant the difference between life and death. But her gaze made everything I did seem small, unworthy. The worst part was seeing Tim change. The man who was cheerful and confident with me suddenly became reserved and quiet in front of his mother. He stopped holding my hand under the table. He stopped laughing so freely. And I understood then I would always be the outsider in this world. That evening, as Tim helped me into my coat, Skylar stood in the hallway, leaned close, and whispered. Just loud enough for me to hear, "Tim is always too trusting, too generous. I hope you understand that is a responsibility." I blurted out quickly, "I love him." She smiled cold as steel. "Of course. But the real question is, do you love him or do you love what he can give you?" I stayed silent, because in that moment I had no idea how long I would have to fight to prove that my love was real. Chapter 3. Marriage under a mother-in-law's pressure. Our wedding should have been the happiest day of my life, but for me it felt more like a silent battle I lost before it even began. From the moment Tim proposed, Skylar seized control of everything. The venue, she dismissed our idea of a small, intimate garden ceremony. "A Morrison wedding can't be something so plain," she said. In the end, it was held at the exclusive country club, where she was a member, a place filled with business associates and partners, not the family and friends who mattered to me. The guest list turned into another fight. I wanted my colleagues from the hospital, the friends who had stood with me through countless grueling shifts, people I considered family. Skylar glanced at the list and said, "Some of these people might not feel comfortable at a Morrison wedding. You wouldn't want them to feel out of place, would you?" It sounded like concern, but her meaning was clear. Ordinary people, working class people, were not welcome in her world. Tim tried to mediate. He told me, "Just put up with Mom a little longer. It'll get easier later." I nodded, but deep down I knew it would never get easier because Skylar never gave ground. On the wedding day, I slipped into my white dress, looked into the mirror, and told myself that what mattered was my love for Tim. But as I walked down the aisle, the rows filled with strangers. In tailored suits, I suddenly felt small, misplaced. My parents sat in modest seats, hesitant among the sea of wealth. Their eyes held both pride and worry, as though they feared I was stepping into a world that would never truly accept me. At the reception, I overheard Skylar speaking to a friend at the bar. "She's sweet, very sincere. But I just hope Tim won't regret being so generous." Generous? As if marrying me was some kind of charitable act. I stood there, my heart tightening, the wine glass trembling in my hand. But then I saw Tim. He was laughing with his friends, his face glowing, his eyes lighting up with happiness whenever they found mine across the crowd. I told myself, as long as he loves me, that's enough. Yet married life quickly proved that love alone was not enough. Sunday family dinners became trials. Skylar always found ways to belittle me. The food I cooked was never authentic. The dress I wore was fine, but next time try something more elegant. The stories I shared were never as interesting as Emma's accomplishments, the future lawyer sister, or the gleaming projects of Morrison Industries. I began to realize in that house I wasn't truly a daughter-in-law. I was an uninvited guest, and every small mistake was magnified as proof that I didn't belong. Tim stayed by my side, but his silent presence often hurt more than his mother's cutting words. Each time I looked at him, hoping for a defense for protection, he only squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Don't mind her. That's just how Mom is." But how could I not mind? How could I forget the constant scrutiny, the feeling of being looked down on right inside the family I was trying so hard to belong to? Those were the first cracks in my marriage, not between Tim and me, but between me and the overwhelming shadow of his mother, a shadow I knew sooner or later would eclipse the love we had for each other. Chapter 4: Infertility, Crisis, and Fragile Hope. By the second year of our marriage, we began talking about having children. I imagined a little one with Tim's smile and my eyes running around our small house. I longed for it, and so did Tim. But month after month, the pregnancy test still showed only one line. At first, we laughed it off, thinking we just needed a little more patience. But patience turned into worry, and worry into obsession. We went to see a doctor. After countless tests, the conclusion was inconclusive, something vague that called difficulty conceiving. The doctor suggested we consider IVF, in vitro fertilization. I sat in that cold clinic, my heart sinking to the floor. I was only 28. I never thought I would be facing something like this. Skylar, of course, found out almost immediately. She never missed a chance to remind me that the biological clock waits for no one. One Sunday evening, she set down her wine glass, looked straight at me, and said, "Perhaps you should see Dr. Richardson. He helped the Weatherby family. Of course, she was a few years younger than you when she started, but there's still hope." I was only 28. Yet, under her gaze, I felt like an old selfish woman who had wasted too much time. Tim squeezed my hand, repeating, "We'll do everything. I promise." And so we stepped into the world of IVF, a world filled with both hope and fear. Daily hormone injections, endless ultrasounds nights. I cried in the bathroom because my body had become an experiment. Tim tried to stay strong, but I could see the strain on his face every time the doctor talked about costs, about success rates. We both knew we'd have to rely on Morris and money, and that meant Skylar would have even more reason to intrude on our lives. Finally, after months of exhaustion, we had 7 healthy embryos stored away in the clinic's lab. I remember how tightly Tim held my hand when the doctor gave us the news, the light of hope sparking in his eyes. "We bought ourselves more time," he said. I nodded, but inside I felt a pang of bitterness. Those 7 embryos felt like tiny seeds of life frozen, waiting for an uncertain future. I didn't know when, or even if, we would ever be ready to welcome one of them into this world. But I knew one thing: I would protect them as if I were protecting the very memory of Tim and me. That night when Skylar called, she didn't ask how I felt. She only said, "It's fortunate the Morrisons can afford this. At least you managed to do one thing right." I clenched my teeth, stayed silent. She would never understand the tears I swallowed, the pinpricks scattered across my stomach, or the nights I held Tim's hand and prayed in the dark. What I didn't know then was that those embryos, those tiny lives suspended in a lab, would one day become my greatest weapon, a weapon Skylar would never see coming. Chapter 5: Illness and Last Words. I still remember the day my world collapsed. Tim had been complaining for weeks about stomach pain and fatigue, but we thought it was just stress from work. Until the moment he nearly collapsed in our kitchen. I rushed him to the hospital where I worked, and, after just a few tests, the doctor's blunt words struck me like a blow to the chest: pancreatic cancer. Late stage. I was paralyzed. Tim sat there, gripping my hand tightly, eyes straight ahead, trying to be strong. But I saw his hands trembling. A lifetime as a nurse had taught me exactly what pancreatic cancer meant. I knew that, even if they spoke of buying months, maybe a year, what we truly had left was only a fragile sliver of time. Skylar moved into our home almost immediately. She said it was to help, but it felt more like an invasion. The fridge was cleared out and restocked with food she brought. She reorganized every doctor's appointment. Once I even walked out of the hospital room only to find Skylar arguing heatedly with the doctor about some miracle treatment she had read about online. Whenever I pushed back, she would throw her words like knives. I'm trying to save my son. And what are you doing? As if my love wasn't enough. As if I was just standing by. Tim grew thinner, weaker, but still managed to smile whenever I entered the room. At night, when Skylar slept on the couch, we finally had a sliver of privacy. I lay beside him, listening to his labored breathing, my heart breaking as he reached out to touch my cheek. One night, as the house lay in silence, Tim whispered, "Kelly, will you promise me something?" Anything, I choked out. "Don't let them win." He didn't need to explain who them was. I knew. I knew it meant his mother, his family, the people who had always seen me as an outsider. I nodded, tears soaking the pillow. "Don't worry. I won't let them take anything that belongs to you. To us." Tim closed his eyes, a weary smile flickering across his lips. That was the last real conversation we ever had. A few days later, he passed away in my arms, while Skylar wept as though she alone had lost a beloved son. I sat by the bed, his hand already cold, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. But even in that grief, his words echoed in my mind like a vow, "Don't let them win." And I swore to myself, no matter how many years it took, I would keep that promise. Chapter 6. The will reading and the burning of the check. Just 3 days after I buried my husband, the phone rang. It was Skylar. Her voice was dry without hesitation. "Tomorrow, 2:00 in the afternoon at Attorney Harrison's office." "We need to settle Tim's estate." I froze. Just yesterday, I had been sitting with Tim's old sweater in my arms, his scent still lingering on the fabric. I hadn't even had time to breathe to cry fully, and now Skylar wanted to drag me into a meeting about assets. When I walked into that office, it felt like stepping into a clan assembly. Not just Skylar, but also her brother, her sister, a handful of distant relatives I had only met once at the wedding. All of them sat there in their fine clothes, their eyes fixed on me as though I were an intruder. Attorney Harrison, an elderly man who had served the Morrison family for decades, began to read the will. I inherited our home Tim's car, some savings, and a substantial trust fund left by Tim's grandfather. The number echoed through the silent room, $2.7 million. I choked up. Not because of the money, but because of the memories. Tim had once spoken about the trips we would take, the plans for our future family. This was his final gift to me. But my emotion lasted only seconds. Because the moment Harrison placed the official check on the table, Skylar shot to her feet and screamed, "Absolutely not. She doesn't deserve a single cent." The room erupted in chaos. Her brother Robert lunged forward and snatched the check right out of the lawyer's hand. I froze in disbelief as he walked straight to the fireplace in the corner. "Oh, sorry about this," Robert sneered and tossed the check into the flames. The fire devoured it, the numbers turning to ash. I stared, my heart sliced open. But what shocked me even more was the applause, the laughter, the cheers of the Morrison family. Skylar clapped as though she had just witnessed a fine performance. Then she turned to me, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "Now you have nothing. No more than the day you walked into this family with empty hands." Attorney Harrison fumed, gathering his documents, muttering about reissuing the check through the bank. But I sat still. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I only watched the fire die down, letting the pain harden into something else, something colder, sharper. They thought they had won. They thought by burning that check they had stripped me of everything. But what they didn't know was that I still held something far more valuable, something untouchable, a secret lying dormant in a laboratory miles away, waiting for me to call its name. I stood up, took my bag, and looked Skylar straight in the eye. "I'm fine," I said, my voice so calm it made her falter for just a moment. "In fact, I've never been better." Then I walked out, leaving them behind to laugh, to plot to divvy up what they believed they had stolen back for themselves. What they didn't know was that from that moment on, I had begun a war, and this time I would not lose. Chapter 7. Withdrawal and Rebuilding Life. I left the lawyer's office that day with trembling hands, but with a heart strangely cold and steady. They thought they had pushed me into utter despair. They thought I would cry beg and then disappear. But in truth, I had only just begun. In the days that followed, Skylar called incessantly. She left dozens of voicemails. We should come to an arrangement. You have nowhere left to go. I listened to them all, then deleted them. Eventually, I changed my number. I didn't need to hear another word from her. I sold the small house Tim and I had shared. It was full of memories, but it was also the place Skylar had once marched into without invitation, cleaning, directing, commanding as though it belonged to her. I couldn't keep living there where every corner bore the imprint of her intrusion. I packed my things, kept only what truly tied me to Tim, and left without telling anyone where I was going. I chose a small town called Willowbrook, 2 hours' drive from the city, far enough that the Morrison family could not reach me yet, close enough that there was a regional hospital where I could work. I rented a modest apartment above a bakery, just 1-bedroom walls, painted a faded beige, but to me it was the first place in years that was truly mine. No trace of Skylar, no scrutinizing eyes, no one but me. As soon as I settled in, I worked with a new doctor, Dr. Chin, to transfer the frozen embryos from the old clinic to a more secure facility. The process took weeks, but I wasn't in a hurry. I knew I was safeguarding the most precious thing I had, and I would protect them at all costs. While waiting, I took a night shift nursing job at the regional hospital. The work was demanding the pay, modest, but I felt lighter than I had in years. No one in Willowbrook knew me as Tim Morrison's wife. I was just Kelly, a dedicated nurse, an ordinary woman trying to rebuild her life. On winter nights, returning to my little apartment, I would sit by the window watching the snow fall, my hand resting on my stomach as I thought about the future. Tim was no longer by my side, but I still held on to what he and I had once longed for: a chance. A small family no one could ever take away. When the doctor informed me that the embryos had been successfully transferred, I smiled quietly. They had burned the check. They had applauded, smug and triumphant, believing I was left with nothing. But what they didn't know was that, even as the flames consumed that piece of paper in a laboratory miles away, the true legacy of Tim and me was still waiting. I wasn't ready to move forward immediately, but I knew with certainty that one day I would call one of those tiny lives into this world. And when that day came, the real battle would begin. Chapter 8. James's birth and the first steps of the legal plan. 8 months after I stepped out of the Morrison shadow on a winter morning, blanketed in snow, I walked into the small Willowbrook clinic where Dr. Chin personally performed the embryo transfer. I pressed my hand tightly against my stomach and whispered silently to Tim, "We're starting again, my love." 2 weeks later, the result appeared. A plus sign. I sat in my tiny bathroom, clutching the test, laughing and crying all at once. A flood of emotions crashed over me: joy, grief, fear, hope. Tim should have been here. Tim should have held me. But instead, there was only me and the tiny life beginning to grow inside me. The day James was born was a cold October morning. After 12 hours of labor, the nurse laid my son on my chest. I looked into his wide eyes, his soft black hair, his long fingers just like Tim's. My heart exploded. "Welcome to the world, James Timothy Morrison," I whispered. I gave him his father's full name so that no one could ever deny his bloodline. But along with that joy came a cold clarity. I knew this James was not just my son. He was living proof, the sole rightful heir of Tim. And one day the name Morrison would return to its rightful place. I began building the legal case when James was still an infant in my arms. His birth certificate listed Tim as his father. The medical records from the lab confirmed the embryos. the documentation of the IVF process, the signed consent from both Tim and me before his death. I copied everything in multiple sets, sent one to a trusted lawyer in a neighboring town, and locked others away in a secure safe. Meanwhile, I lived quietly. By day, I worked as a nurse. By night, I came home to my small apartment and cradled James. If anyone asked about his father, I gave the same short answer: he passed away. No one pressed further. In Willowbrook, I was just a young widow raising a child alone. But in truth, I was raising not just a boy, but a weapon. James grew to be gentle bright. At 3 years old, he loved flipping through my wedding album with Tim. I told him stories about his father, a good man, funny, who loved blueberry muffins and terrible action movies. James smiled, his eyes lighting up with a pride he didn't yet understand. And me. Every night after putting James to bed, I sat at my desk, opened the thick folder of documents, and added piece by piece to the bigger picture. I wasn't rushing. I knew time was on my side. The Morrison family thought they had erased me from Tim's life, but the truth was I was quietly preparing step by step for the day they would pay the price. Chapter 9. A Legal Alliance and the First Counterstrike. When James turned 3, I knew it was time to find an ally. Alone I could protect my son, but to claim justice and make the Morrison family pay for what they had done, I needed someone who knew the law and who was willing to fight to the end. I was introduced to Rebecca Torres through a nurse colleague. She told me Rebecca specialized in tough cases, especially inheritance disputes. I found Rebecca's office a small room on the second floor above a sandwich shop. Nothing glamorous, but in the sharp glint of that lawyer's eyes, I saw the fierce determination I needed. "Tell me everything," Rebecca said, pen poised in hand. And I did. From the first night, I overheard my mother-in-law whisper that I wasn't worthy to the day Tim died, to the will reading the check thrown into the fire, and the applause that followed. Then I handed Rebecca the folders I had prepared: James's birth certificate, the IVF records documentation, proving Tim was his biological father, all certified. Rebecca read them, turning each page, nodding slowly. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, lips curling into a cold smile. "They think you've lost everything," Rebecca said. "But the truth is, you're holding the most important piece on the board. And I promise you, Kelly will make them destroy themselves with their own greed." From that moment, we began planning. Rebecca didn't rush to strike. She taught me patience. The longer the trap is set, the more painful the fall. We monitored Morrison Industries, the corporation Scarlet and her family still flaunted as their pride. I learned to read financial reports to spot tiny cracks in the system. Rebecca gathered evidence of asset destruction and fraudulent management of the estate. Meanwhile, I lived quietly as any single mother would. I took James to preschool, worked night shifts at the hospital, came home to make breakfast, listened to his stories. But in every ordinary moment, I knew I was raising not just a child, but justice itself. The first counterstrike came unexpectedly. Rebecca uncovered an old clause in the land records the mansion Skylar lived in actually carried a stipulation from Tim's grandfather that if the Morrison male line ended, ownership reverted to the widow of the last heir. That meant the mansion never truly belonged to Skylar. It belonged to me and to James. When Rebecca handed me that document, my hands shook, but this time not from fear. It was the surge of power. For years, they had treated me as an outsider, as nothing. But now, line by line, page by page, the law itself was proving the opposite. I was the one they had never expected, the one who could topple their entire empire. I kissed James's hair as he slept and whispered, "My son, everything they tried to take from us, I will reclaim it all, not just for me, but for you, for your father's true legacy." And in the stillness of the night, I felt it clearly: the war had truly begun. Chapter 10. The Collapse of Morrison Industries and the Fateful Trial. On the day Morrison Industries officially declared bankruptcy, I was sitting in my small apartment, James playing with building blocks on the floor while I held a cup of hot coffee. The news anchor's voice filled the room. The decades-old construction empire now stands on the brink of collapse, due to financial crises, shareholder disputes, and management misconduct. To the public, it seemed like a sudden fall, but I knew it was anything but accidental. Every crack, every fracture was the result of seeds I had planted. Rebecca called immediately after "It's time, Kelly. We're bringing everything into the light." Dozens of thick binders were submitted to the court. Inside was everything proof that Skylar and her family had burned the inheritance check in front of an attorney, the IVF records and medical files proving James was Tim's biological son, the will, and the old property clause. Every document, every seal, every line legitimate and undeniable. On the day of trial, I wore a simple black dress. James was safe at school, shielded from watching his mother face off against his grandmother. The courtroom was packed reporters, curious onlookers, and even those who had once fawned over the Morrisons, but now came to watch their downfall. Skylar sat across the aisle, her face gaunt, still trying to project arrogance. But I saw her hand trembling beneath her gloves. When the video from the law office played the scene of Robert snatching the check, tossing it into the flames, the family applauding while Skylar smiled wickedly, the entire courtroom erupted in gasps. Rebecca rose to her full height, her voice echoing, "Your Honor, this is not merely the destruction of property. This is proof of cruelty, of a deliberate attempt to rob a child of his inheritance. James Timothy Morrison, the sole and legitimate son of Timothy Morrison, was stripped of his birthright before he was even born." I stood holding a photo of James. My heart trembled, but my voice was steadier than it had ever been. "This is my son, and this is the only grandson of Skylar Morrison. This boy is the reason Tim continues to live through me. No one, not even the Morrison family, has the right to deny him." Skylar's face went pale as she collapsed into her seat. Her eyes locked on the photo as if she were staring at a ghost. She had fought her whole life to preserve the Morrison name, but now that very name was the evidence of her defeat. When the verdict was read, the room fell silent. The court recognizes James Timothy Morrison as the sole legal heir. All assets, including the trust fund and properties, are to be transferred into the child's trust. The defendants are found guilty of willful destruction of inheritance and are liable for full restitution with interest. Skylar broke down in tears. No longer the tears of a powerful matriarch, but the choking sobs of a woman who had lost everything: her son, her honor, her wealth, and the mansion she had once treated as the fortress of her dynasty. I turned away, never looking at her again. Not because my anger was gone, but because I no longer needed to see. She had destroyed herself. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight poured down the cold wind, brushing my face. Rebecca gripped my shoulder gently and whispered, "You did it." I drew a deep breath, feeling for the first time in years truly free. I had not only restored justice for Tim, I had protected James, safeguarded my son's future. And most of all, I had kept Tim's final promise alive. Don't let them win. Effort 2, Chapter 11, After the War and Building a New Legacy. When the trial ended, I thought I would feel triumphant, but what I felt instead was a deep, quiet relief. I no longer had to brace myself against Skylar and the Morrison family. The court had spoken for me. Justice had chosen James. The mansion Skylar had once considered the heart of the Morrison dynasty now belonged to my son. The day I walked through those gates, holding James's hand tightly in mine, I felt Tim's presence all around us. The walls that had once witnessed cold stares and dinners, filled with disdain, now echoed with James's laughter. I had transformed what had been my spiritual prison into our home. I didn't keep much of the old furniture. Most of the Morrisons' gaudy, ostentatious possessions, the heavy decor, the portraits, the symbols of wealth, I donated to charity or sold at auction. The house needed to be freed from Skylar's shadow. I changed the curtains, repainted the walls, placed fresh flowers that Tim had once loved. Every room now bore the imprint of James and me, no longer contempt, only love and hope. The compensation and James's trust fund were more than enough to keep us comfortable for life. But I didn't want to stop there. I remembered my promise to Tim to live with meaning, not let the past define me. So I created the Timothy Morrison Foundation, an organization to support women and children stripped of inheritance rights or oppressed by their families. I wanted to transform my pain into strength for others. On the foundation's opening day, I stood at the podium, James sitting in the front row, his eyes shining with pride. I said, "This is not just my story. This is the story of those who have been dismissed, denied, yet who rose to claim justice. Tim is no longer here, but his love lives on in James and in every person we can help." And Skylar, I heard she moved in with a cousin. From a powerful woman who once reigned over charity galas, she now lived quietly avoiding the press. Sometimes I wondered if she ever felt regret, but then I realized the answer no longer mattered. She had chosen her path, and I had chosen mine. I no longer stayed awake at night with anger or regret. Now I stayed up late reading fairy tales to James, drafting plans for the foundation, smiling as I thought of the future. One evening, James sat in the living room holding a photo frame of Tim and whispered, "Mama, I think Papa would be so proud." I held him close, my eyes blurring with tears. "Yes, sweetheart. Papa would be proud, and Mama is proud of you too." In that moment, I knew my war had truly ended. Not through bitter revenge, but through rebuilding with love, with justice, with a legacy that would endure. I hadn't let them win. I had won in my own way. And above all, somewhere out there, Tim was surely smiling. When it was all over, I no longer felt anger or bitterness. I had kept my promise to Tim, don't let them win. I had turned pain into strength, loss into legacy. Now James grows up in the house that was once the symbol of the Morrisons' power. But for us, it is simply a home filled with love and laughter. The Morrison family may have lost everything, but I gained what mattered most, freedom, justice, and a new future for my son. And more than anything, I know that somewhere, Tim is smiling proud that we never gave up. And you, if this story has made you believe that love and justice always find a way to win, be sure to leave a comment about the moment that struck you most, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next true Reddit stories and revenge stories here on Scarlet Vows.